Welcome viewers to another program in the series entitled CSEC Circle. It's primarily intended for students and teachers preparing for the CSEC English B Literature exam, but we hope that anybody who is viewing will be able to benefit. In this program, we are going to be discussing a poem entitled Death Be Not Proud by the English poet John Donne. With me to participate in this discussion are Adam Webb, Roderick Gittins, and Dawn Marie O'Neill, all of whom are teachers of literature. I'm the moderator, Samuel Sawyer, and I'm a lover of literature. As we proceed this morning, we are hoping to discuss Death Be Not Proud in three phases. First, to look at the content of the poem. Secondly, to engage with the poet's use of literary devices. And thirdly, to consider extra textual information, that is something that's not part of the poem, but may be part of the history or the culture or the country or the writer's life, which might benefit students and teachers. Let's begin with an identification of the subject. What is Death Be Not Proud about? Who would like to respond to that?
Well, they always say ladies first.
Well, I would say that Death Be Not Proud focuses primarily on death. We can see that death is being addressed in some way just from the title. It's telling death not to be proud for some particular reason, and we will see as we go through the poem how it deals with death in this way.
Thank you, Dawn Marie. Now, viewers, I want to remind you, even though you know this, sometimes it may not be at the forefront of awareness, that literature is not like mathematics. In mathematics, there is a correct answer, and there may be different methods of arriving at the correct answer, but there is a correct answer. In literature, there is no necessarily one correct answer. There are various interpretations, and all of them are not equal. The interpretations that matter are the ones which you as students and readers are able to support by referring to the poem primarily or material related to it. But some interpretations, much as you may cherish them, don't make sense because you can't adequately support them from the text. And therefore, as students, those are the interpretations that you definitely want to avoid. Let me give you an example. Dawn Marie has just identified death as the subject or topic of this poem, and most people would agree with that. However, there are other readers who argue, at least one of them, that the subject of this poem is really death's pride, death's haughtiness, death's arrogance. Now, you will need to decide for yourself which, if either of these two identifications, you think is the correct one. But more than one has been expressed by different readers. So let's go a step further. So we know that in this poem, the persona or the speaker is dealing with the topic of death or a particular attitude on the part of death, which is identified as pride. Let's consider now the situation of the poem. And the reason we are doing this is because one of the questions that CSEC students have to answer in literature is to summarize what is the situation in the poem. So it's a good idea that you cover those basics in your preparation, as we will do for you here on the program this morning. So, Roderick, could you outline for us briefly what the situation is in this poem? What's the circumstance as represented by the words on the page?
Yeah, I like that introduction, Sam. And to be honest, it's interesting what the poet is doing here. It's almost as though he's having a conversation with death. So right away you get that very personal touch, that in your face. And John Donne is interesting in his approach. He challenges, he confronts. And of course, with death, normally one would say that's a scary topic or a scary thing to confront. But John Donne puts it in such a way that the reader is comfortable and we can almost have a conversation with death. And you get the feeling as though death is not even in charge. It's almost as though the reader and the poet, they're the ones taking charge of the conversation. They're the ones taking charge of the activity. And I like that approach right from the beginning. Death be not proud. So it's a challenge, it's a confrontation, it's a conversation with death. And interestingly for our viewers and for the readers, it engages you on a personal level where you can have a relaxing conversation almost with your worst fear. So even in terms of, as you mentioned before, literature being about life, it could also teach us to confront the things that perhaps we are afraid of and deal with them on a face-to-face basis. And I like that about John Donne and this particular poem.
So Roderick has shared with us that it's a valuable thing to see this poem as a situation in which the persona or speaker is having a conversation, a confrontation with death, presenting death with a challenge. Let's hear from Adam now, who we're going to invite to take us through the 4 phases of this conversation, which ultimately constitutes an argument.
Okay, thank you. So without going too much into the form and structure, we can generally see 4 stages through which the speaker takes us. At first, the point of the argument is set before us, the thesis statement, perhaps, death be not proud. So obviously we have a situation where death has a particular attitude and the speaker is combating that attitude. And so he will therefore, in the coming phases of the poem, he will therefore need to justify this idea that death should not be proud. So we see that death is proud, and we see why death is proud. Death is proud because some have called thee mighty and dreadful, as we see in line 2. But then, as we move on to another phase, we see that death should not be proud because the power that death thinks that it has is just a delusion. Death is not actually powerful. And so the speaker builds out this logical argument against death. Usually when we look at poems dealing with death, we're working with emotion and we have this sense of mystery and danger and dread. But the speaker here is attacking death with a very logical, a very coherent and cohesive argument. And so we see, death, you should not be proud, and here's why. The speaker lists out some reasons. For example, you bring us pleasure. You are not able to kill us as you think you are able. And actually your main purpose is just to deliver us to a better life. And so as we move through the poem, the speaker goes from not just giving us reasons why death should not be proud, but he goes on to insult death. He goes on to disrespect death and belittle death. And then finally, as we get to what might be the conclusion of the poem, we see the end of death. And this is an ending that we do not usually think of. We see death as the end of us, but through this argument, and as we touch on form later on, we'll be able to really separate the different stages of the argument. Through this argument, the speaker is giving us a reimagination, a reconceptualization of death. Because we now see death as something to dread and fear. That is our relationship with death. And so the speaker is basically writing an essay. We have a wonderful introduction. We have some body paragraphs and we have evidences. We have even some persuasive devices if you want to compare it to writing an essay. And then at the end we have a nice conclusion. And the conclusion here, it deals with the audience. It tells us our end. We will sleep for a short time and then wake eternally. And it tells us the end of death, which is that death shall die. So with this argumentative structure, the speaker really shows us that we do not have to approach death with this sense of mystery and dread and fear. But if you look at it logically and just use even a more scientific approach, just use the facts and make some deductions, we will see that death is really nothing to fear. In fact, death should fear itself and death should fear us because we have power over death.
Thank you, Adam. So viewers, as you've heard, this is a poem in which the speaker deals with the subject of death in a way which, as Roderick pointed out, can make us more comfortable in dealing with an aspect of human life that is normally perceived to be troublesome. problematic, frightening, overwhelming. And we've just gone through a number of years of a pandemic called COVID-19 in which millions of people have died. So we're sure that you understand the way in which death could occupy the thoughts and the emotions of people. But as Roderick has pointed out, Donne's approach is to engage with death not on an emotional level, but on the level of reason and logic, and to present an argument as to why death is really powerless, and by implication, we human beings need not be terrified by death. As you would have heard in our discussion so far, this poem is organized in a distinctive way. It's presented as a challenge, a conversation, a confrontation in which an argument is being presented. And this argument is shared or advances in 4 steps or 4 phases. So we now on the panel are going to share with you the details of these 4 phases so that you can appreciate the way in which, as a writer, John Donne is connecting the structure or the form or the arrangement of his poem to his content and his argument. First, we have a group of 4 lines with a particular rhyme scheme. Adam is going to talk about that and summarize for you the argument being presented there. Adam?
All right, so I can see 2 main sort of introductions happening in these first 4 lines. First of all, we see what the problem is that's going to be sorted out or going to be solved by our speaker here. The problem is death is proud and death should not be proud. Right? Death is proud, but it should not be proud. So that is sort of an introduction to the problem. And we have the introduction dealing not only with death and its issue, but also with the general audience, the readers perhaps, which is we should not be fearing death because death cannot kill us. In the first 4 lines, the speaker says that death cannot kill him, and death does not kill the persons that it thinks it kills. And so these first 4 lines are giving us that double introduction. Death, you should not be proud. We have no reason to fear death.
Thank you, Adam. And as readers, when you look at the final word of each line, you will notice that the poet is using a particular pattern of rhyming. So line 1 ends with the word thee, which rhymes with the word me at the end of line 4. And in between, you have line 2 and 3, so and throw. So in studying poetry, we would call this the rhyme scheme because there's a pattern. And we have here an A for thee, a B for so, a B for throw because it's the same song. And then we go back to the song E again in line 4. So we would say the rhyme scheme of the first 4 lines is A, B, B, A. So the poet is using rhyme as a way of signaling the relationship and the unity of this first group of 4 lines. And now Dawn Marie is going to talk about the second group of 4 lines where we've got be, flow, go, and re. So once again, those 2 songs, the A song E and the B song O, are being repeated to signal that this next group of 4 lines, lines 5 to 8, is a unit. So Dawn Marie is going to talk about that and how it corresponds to the second step in this argument being presented by the persona. Dawn Marie.
Okay, so in keeping with the argumentative structure of the poem, we see here the persona is going into talking about how we should not fear death because just like how we rest and sleep, we can see in line 5, from rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, it's talking about how death is similar to how when we sleep, when we rest, and how we get pleasure from resting and sleeping, that we should not fear it because rest and sleep is just as nice to us. So we're further disempowering death. And then we're going on to saying that, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery, mainly talking about how death is mainly a vector or another channel where we can go to similar rest, where, we won't have to fear it as much as we would often do.
That's right, Dawn Marie. So thank you. So notice, listeners, viewers, and students, that in this second phase of the poem, the second group of 4 lines, rhyming A, B, B, A, the persona presents the argument that because people benefit from resting and sleeping, and there are, as it were, versions of death, we should benefit even more from death itself. In fact, the good people, whoever those happen to be, in your opinion, seem to want to go sooner rather than later to enjoy the pleasures that death brings. Now let's transition to the third phase of this poem. That third group of 4 lines, and now we notice that the rhyme scheme is going to change. So from lines 9 to 12, instead of the E song and the O song, we've now gone to thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Then, so that's a C. Dwell is a D song. Well rhymes with dwell, which is also D, and then rhyming with men would be C. So the pattern of rhyme here in lines 9 to 12 is C, D, C. Roderick, please talk about that and the relationship to the argument being presented.
Yes, exactly. And it is interesting. It's almost as though with this shift in the rhyme scheme, he's also shifted the ferocity of the attack, because this is the first time where he engages with death in a much sterner tone. He tells him, you are slave to fate. So it's a very condescending tone as well. He's taunting death, telling him he's a slave, and he's operating only by chance. You notice he says, thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. So rather than death having that compelling power over man, it's almost as though man has the power over death. And I thought that was extremely interesting. So he tells him, you are not mighty or powerful. And even he links death, or he diminishes the power of death or the value of it by linking it with something. He says, poison, war, and sickness. So death, as it were, has lost that hierarchy, and he drops down to a lower rung. You are now mixed with just poison, because these are the things that can actually kill. So death, you really have no power at all. So that taunt and those accusations also allow the reader, as you mentioned before, the readers can now have a sense of empowerment. They can feel as though they can take charge not only of their own lives, but interestingly, of their own deaths. And that leads beautifully into the last 2 lines, Sam, which I want us to touch on, because I think that's going to be fairly controversial as well. So those 4 lines, there's a shift in rhyme scheme, but there's also a shift in the attack, or that confrontational nature between done versus death.
Thank you, Roderick. So viewers, you will notice that Roderick has used certain words such as shift in the attack, demeaning or speaking to death in a condescending way. And at this point, we are therefore focused on the tone, the attitude of the speaker towards death and this subject of death. So as a student preparing for CXC English Literature, it is very important for you to pay attention to the attitude of the speaking voice in relation to the topic. And you will notice that words such as serious versus humorous or amusing would characterize the tone of this piece. The speaker is dealing with an important matter, a matter of universal significance. Death is important to people all over the planet, all throughout history and every civilization. So it is not being treated in a frivolous or flippant or amusing manner. The tone is a serious tone. But we would also use other words to be more specific about it. The tone is confrontational from the beginning, the sense of the challenge and the argument being presented. And as Roderick just pointed out, the speaker becomes even more defiant, even more critical. You can sense almost an undercurrent of ridicule being expressed towards death in this argument that death is really powerless. And as Roderick pointed out a minute or 2 ago, the persona argues that in fact death depends on influences such as fate and chance, powerful political people such as kings, and even just criminal, evil-minded, bad people, or people who are so hopeless that they're going to end their lives by committing suicide, desperate men, in order to get its victims, people. So it is not death that really kills people That's the argument being presented by the person. It is really these other things who must destroy them, and then death gets control over them. Now we come in terms of the progression of this argument and the structure or the form of this 14-line poem called a sonnet to the last 2 lines. Now, this form of poem, the sonnet, is said to have originated in Italy, where typically you would have an 8-line section followed by a 6-line section called an octave and a sestet. When it was brought to England, the English writers, of course, diversified the form or changed it up to suit themselves, and there's nothing wrong with that. And the most famous poet who did this was Shakespeare. And instead of having a group of 8 lines and 6 lines, he would typically produce a 14-line poem with 3 groups of 4 lines and then a concluding 2 lines called a couplet. So when you look at this poem by Donne, it's really a combination of the original Italian structure of 8 and 6 lines and the Shakespearean one of 3 groups of 4 lines and a 2-line to put the finishing touches, the brilliant final point to the argument. So let's see it. One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Now you would have noticed that when I pronounced the word at the end of line 13, I didn't say eternally, I said eternally. Scholars would tell us that in Donne's day, the 17th century, that's how the word was being pronounced, and that's why we could say it rhymes with die. Now Roderick pointed out that these 2 lines may in fact evoke some controversy, and that's all right because all readers of literature don't always agree. So Roderick, perhaps you would like to tell us what your understanding of the final 2 lines is. And if we've got different interpretations, we will share them with our viewers.
Yeah, well, with this one, and we can also touch on, we can't look at it in a bubble. We also have to understand where John Donne was coming from, his background, and we're going to touch on that a little bit later on as we come up. But having a very religious background, this final couplet becomes extremely important. One short sleep past is almost as though death is shortened, we wake eternally. So our eternal life. So yes, death therefore loses all power. Is the final trumping of death, because essentially we're transitioning from one life to another.
Normal human life.
Normal human life into a far more spiritual plane. And of course, as a metaphysical poet, John Donne is at home in this particular element. But then he concludes, and I use that word deliberately, he concludes the life of death by saying, you shall be no more. And that, of course, will touch on the religious allusion, biblical allusion to Revelation, of where it says death will be no more. So for our viewers out there, we have to appreciate that literature is about life. It's also about growing. It's about learning. And the religious aspect comes deeply into this poem because we're dealing with a very, very sentimental topic to most Christians. And that's why these particular final couplet is wonderful. So Sam, I really want to hear your feeling on these 2 lines as well.
Okay, before we come to my feeling on them, Adam, is there anything that you would like to add, or Dawn Marie, about these 2 lines?
Well, if we can touch a little bit on the punctuation and perhaps the diction of these 2 lines, I would say one short sleep past, and then we have that comma right there, which we might call a caesura, since we're having a breakage midline. And then we wake eternally. And then that's somewhat mirrored in the 14th line when we have, and death shall be no more. We have that breakage again, death thou shalt die. I think these breakages reinforce the duality of the audience of the poem, in that we have 2 audiences being spoken to. We have death being spoken to, as we see from the very title, death be not proud, is a direct statement to death. But we also have the we wake eternally, which we can bring back to the some people who find that death to be mighty and dreadful. So in these last 2 lines, we can say that there's a conclusion for death and a conclusion for us. The conclusion for death in line 13, one short sleep passed, and then, because if the short sleep has passed, then death has no more job to do. Death only has a job to do when there are people to put to sleep. And then we have we wake eternally. The speaker is now focusing on us, on our ending, or our beginning perhaps. And then in line 14, and death shall be no more. The speaker is speaking to us, telling us what's going to happen to death in the third person. And then the speaker turns his head to death and speaks directly. Death, thou shalt die. So I think it's interesting that even in the conclusion, it's reinforced that this is not just me barraging and disrespecting and belittling death. This is also a sermon to you, to the people who fear death.
Thank you very much, Adam. You'll notice Adam's use of the word sermon, and we know as a historical fact that for part of his life, the latter part, Donne was the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in England. We know that he grew up in an essentially Catholic family and he converted to Anglicanism. So religion has been central to his life throughout it, and he died somewhere in the vicinity of 58 or 59 years. So it could be argued that this poem is essentially religious in its outlook. We may even want to claim that beyond general religion, it is Christian in its outlook, because the poem ends with a reference to the Bible, what we call a biblical allusion. An allusion is any reference inside a literary work to something outside the literary work. In this case, the reference is to the Bible, to Revelation chapter 20, verse 14, in which we read that death and hell after the great white throne judgment are cast into the lake of fire, which is why Donne will write that death thou shalt die. So in our normal human way of thinking, if we don't have a Christian or religious perspective, we think of death as an abstraction. It's a concept that represents non-living. When people are not living anymore, they're dead. And death is not a person, it is some sort of force that robs people of life. But from the Christian perspective, death is an entity, though not human, which itself, once God returns to refresh the world and to separate the sinners from the righteous people, will actually be killed. And so that is the basis for Donne's conclusion, death thou shalt die, as well as his conclusion that by implication, good people, religious people, God-fearing people, or more specifically Christians, because they followed the rules of God, will be given eternal life in contrast to the brief life we have now, and then we die. So it's interesting that in our discussion, we've ended by focusing at this point on the techniques and the craftsmanship and the figurative language of the poem. So we'll have to go back to the beginning now and work our way down to the end, because we began at the end. We also want to remind our viewers, students, and teachers that in these last two lines, line 14 in particular, we haven't only got a biblical allusion, a reference to the Bible incorporated into the poem, but we've got the use of a device called paradox, where a writer or a speaker will say something or write something that does not seem to make any sense. But when you think about it, you see the logic or the reason. So as Roderick pointed out, and Adam agreed, we normally think of death as something that is powerful and final in itself. We don't usually think that death has an expiry date, that death itself will die. So when John Donne writes this, we would term it a paradox. So let's go back to the very beginning of the poem. So we've looked at the structure of the poem. We recognize it's essentially an argument. We've traced the presentation of this argument from the beginning to the end. So let's consider now the various techniques which are prominent in this poem in the presentation of this argument on the subject of death. Let's start at the beginning. We would say, if we were using English and not talking about literature, we would say death is an abstraction. It's really an idea. It's not a human being, it's not an animal, it's not a plant, or it's not a fish. It hasn't got any, as it were, bodily existence. It's a word people use to describe a state of non-living. So when the poet begins, or the persona rather, death, be not proud, there's a name we have for that. when a speaker addresses something that's an abstraction or idea, we call it an apostrophe. But in literature, it means a speaker talks to something that is not real, not a human being, as though it were one. Apostrophe. So the poem opens with an apostrophe. And when the persona speaks of death being proud, now this attitude of thinking too highly of yourself, thinking you're more important than you really are, is of course a human thing. As far as we know, birds and fish and trees don't feel pride. So what's the term that we use for that? What is that way of using language called? Speak to us, panel.
Well, of course, we're talking about the personification.
That's right, Roderick.
So death here is being personified. And there's something that I wanted to mention earlier that perhaps might be significant as well, Sam. The fact that throughout this entire poem, there's no response. Death is not allowed to respond throughout the poem. So I thought that was also an interesting point to toss in there, as well as we're looking at the personification of death. There's no reply to John Donne's assertions.
Very good, Roderick. So I just want to iterate a point you made several minutes ago, and this one that you just made. You said that the way the persona is speaking to death serves to reduce or render death's influence as powerless. You said that a while ago. So one way of dealing with something that is normally considered to be bigger than you and more powerful is to cut it down to size using language. So by personifying death, yes, the persona is making it more manageable for a human being to be able to make sense of it and argue that death is really powerless. So that's a good point. And the second point, yes, just reiterate that second point for us again. The one that you said you wanted to make.
In terms of the lack of reply?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So one of the features of many of Donne's poems is that they create this impression of a conversation. And particularly for you students and teachers living in the 21st century, you know, black people have been trying to get fair treatment and equality. Women have been trying to get fair treatment and equality, and lots of other groups of people in the world. And one of the terms that has become very popular in recent years is giving a voice, having a voice. And that's the point that Roderick just made. By treating death as though it is a human being capable of being spoken to, chastised verbally, the persona is denying death a voice. So we never hear a response from death. We only hear what the human speaker is saying. Death doesn't get a word in. Yes, Adam?
If I may continue on that just a little bit on what Roderick mentioned and what you have elaborated on a little bit. As you look at the personification, and I like to call this anthropomorphism, because I think death is made into a person in the poem, as opposed to just being, ascribed some human characteristics. But whether I want to call it personification or anthropomorphism, I am pretty interested in looking at the effect of this. Why would the speaker employ this particular device, not just in a couple of lines, but as a pervasive device throughout the entire poem? And we know, as Samuel said, that by personifying death, we're cutting it down to size. We're no longer dealing with this mysterious entity this enigma. We're not dealing with a person. And humans are only that strong. And so that is one aspect of it. And the aspect where death cannot respond. Of course, if death could actually respond to all of these arguments, who knows what death would say? Death might have some good comebacks. Death might have valid arguments. In fact, if I were death, I would be furious, not because of the argument, but because of my inability to respond. Because we are now seeing all of this new idea of death through the lens of one particular person. So it's a very one-sided, a very subjective, a biased argument. So even though Donne here is trying to paint the image of a fair, logical argument from which we can come to sensible conclusions, we have to realize that it's not really a conversation, it's not a debate, it's not a dialogue. It's just one person chastising another person, or something that is treated as a person. And so as we look at these devices going forward, not just the personification, let's try to identify the effectiveness, the reason behind using these particular devices, as much as we look at the reason for including certain words as we look at diction.
That's a very good point, Adam, and a good reminder for our students and teachers, particularly the students, that when you are engaging with exam questions about literature, you know for sure CXC is going to ask you to identify some major device in the poem and to discuss its effectiveness. And you've had two good examples of that being done by Roderick and by Adam. So we're not just naming rhetorical or figurative language. We're considering what the poet gains by using language in this way. So now I'd like to take you to line 9 of the poem, where we can see another technique being used in the advancement of the argument being presented by the persona, where the speaker says to death, "Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men." And then later, "and doth with poison, war, and sickness dwell." Now, when we go to the supermarket and we are likely to forget the things we want to buy, we write something called a list. When poets do it, we don't call it a list. We call it a catalog. So I'm going to invite any of the panelists to talk about the effect of this catalog in the poem. Because as Adam just reminded us, and as he and Roderick demonstrated, it's not enough for students of literature to name devices or techniques. We need to consider their purpose, their effectiveness, or lack of it.
So, all right, if I may start on the catalog here, I'm particularly interested in the catalogs. We have not just one catalog, but two. As we look at 910, we see another sort of list of things. We see poison, war, sickness. But first, dealing with line 9, the word slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. When we're writing a persuasive essay, we're still dealing with English B here. We're drawing from some English B, English A knowledge.
Yes.
When we're writing a persuasive essay, we cannot just make claims out of thin air and leave them like that. No matter how solid we think our opinion is, if we cannot provide evidence, then our claims are eventually baseless. So one of the effects of this catalog here, fate, chance, kings, desperate men, the speaker is putting us at ease. The speaker is putting us at ease, wherein we can trust in his credibility, because guess what? He has evidence. He has a whole list. He's not just making a claim and leaving it up to our imaginations to believe him or come up with scenarios. He's saying, look, death, you are weak. Death, you're not powerful at all. In fact, I can list off the top of my head 4 things that have power over you. You're a slave to these things. So death, you're not the slave master. You're the one just doing the bidding of all of these guys. So imagine, you think you're the ringleader, but you're just going around doing favors, being pushed around and being bullied. You're not the big bully here. And so we say we have fate. When we look at fate, what is the relationship between fate and death? Death has to obey fate. Fate is the prescribed end, the destiny. And if the destiny is for me to die by a car crash, God forbid, then death cannot argue with that. Death cannot say, well, you know what, I'm going to take down Adam by lightning instead. No, death, you get this note, you have to you're just a delivery boy. Go ahead and do what I tell you. That is what the relationship between faith and death looks like. Look at chance. Look at chance. If just by bad luck, I meet a rueful end. Just by accident. It's not that death decided to take me down. It's just luck. It's just chance. And death just has to go along with it. Maybe death can take the credit for it, but this isn't actually death's doing. When you look at kings, of course you know that kings, well, back then, were men who could say off with their heads, and that is it. It's not death who is going around determining who is going to live or die. It's the kings. And even the same little weak, desperate men, we have moved from enigmatic entities like fate and chance down to the greatest men, and now we're even at the bottom of the barrel, desperate men. So death really has control over no one at all. No matter how small you are bigger than death. That is the idea here. And if you look at the order, we've spoken about this, if you look at the order of these slave masters of death, we see that we go from big to small. We go from important to insignificant. From fate, the greatest universal force, to chance, still great, but not quite as great as fate. To kings, we're getting a little lower because we're now in the human realm, but kings are the best of men. And then even the desperate men. So he's listing the evidences, he's one by one. Okay, you think you're great? Look at fate. We put a check mark. All right, now look at chance. So what about humans? You think you can beat humans? Look at kings. Look at desperate men. And I think if Donne had a couple more lines to spare, he would just keep listing off slave masters of death. And as we go into line 10, we see another catalog. We see all of the low, weak, disgusting company that death keeps. So death isn't rolling with the top shots. Death isn't anything that can demand respect or fear, because you are just being bossed around, and the company you keep is quite despicable. So I think that is one of the major effects, at least in my opinion, of these catalogs here in lines 9 and 10.
So notice again, viewers and students, the way in which you will draw on your understanding of the craftsmanship of the poet, how language is being used in order to achieve a particular purpose, and not just think of a poem as a random collection of figurative devices. Now, at this point, let's come to this line 12, yes, line 12. Adam had previously pointed out that we've got in these lines, 12 included, a device called caesura, where by using punctuation marks of some kind, the poet inserts a pause. And all pauses are pauses, but all pauses do not serve the same purpose in a literary work. So let's look at line 12, which runs on or continues from line 11, which continues from previous lines. So line 11 reads, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke. Then we've got that full stop demanding a pause to consider. And then we've got a question. What kind of question is this? Why swellst thou then? Now, you students know from doing English language that there are two types of questions, generally speaking. One is called a question, and the second is called a rhetorical question. Panel, which kind of question do we have here, and what's the effect of that kind of question?
We have a rhetorical question here. It's asked when you don't really want a response, or you don't warrant a response. So you just ask the question and you move on. Here, so when Donne says, why swellest thou then, it's reinforcing the disempowerment, the belittling of death. Again, as our panelist said, he's not really giving death the chance to respond. He just asks his question to make his point. He says that these poppy and charms, these drafts make us sleep better than your stroke. Asks the question to make his point, and then directly moves on to another stronger point in line.
Thank you, Dawn Marie. That is well put. Now, you might recall that a long time ago at the top of this program, I said that what we hope to do would be to look at the content of this poem, then to consider the use of figurative devices or techniques of language use in the poem, and lastly, to consider extra-textual information, something that's not on the page itself, that comes from Donne's life or the history of the period or the country he was writing in and so on, that might help us to appreciate the poem in a way that we might not appreciate it if we didn't know this extra textual information. So at this point, I'm going to invite the panelists for a minute or two each, if they want to share any extra textual information they think might benefit you and tell you why.
One more small thing to add to the previous section. There's one more device used kind of subtly that works in tandem with the cataloging of evidence here, that we can call repetition. But specifically, it's an anaphora, as we have a repetition at the beginning of the lines. If you look at lines 10, 11, 12, and even up to line 7, all of these lines begin with and soonest or best men, and dust with poison, and pop your charms, and better than thy stroke. And then even at the end, but we'll look at line 14, and this anaphora here, it continues to reinforce the idea that the speaker has an overabundance of evidence with which to support this point, that death should not in fact be proud. And so we see here some lists, some catalogs, but with all of these, and I get the impression that it's only because the page has a finite space. But if the poet were to go on for another 100 lines, there would still be more and more evidence. So as we look at the repetitions, we can ask ourselves why the poet would choose to repeat a particular word, even if it's a simple, innocuous word as and.
Thank you, Adam. So Adam has highlighted for us the cumulative effect of repeating the word and, to give the sense that the speaker, the persona, has an overabundance of evidence, and it is only the limitation of the poem because it's a 14-line poem with roughly 10 syllables in each line. But if he had more space and perhaps more time, he could give us endless evidence of death's powerlessness. Excellent point. So in fact, before we go to the sharing of extra textual information, I'll just do a quick summation of some of the key figurative devices that we would have discussed in our presentation this morning for you students and teachers. So we talked about apostrophe in terms of speaking to death and abstraction as though it were a person capable of hearing and understanding. The presentation of death as a human being who is conceited, haughty, arrogant, and proud, personification. We identified the use of the catalog or list, and we talked about the effects of these things. We pointed as well, in case of Adam most recently, to anaphora, the use of repetition, which serves particular purposes. We indicated that in the end of the poem, we've got the use of paradox and ultimately a biblical allusion to Revelation 20:14, that death and hell will be cast into the lake of fire following the great white throne judgment. We pointed to, throughout our presentation, to the use of rhyme to link particular parts of the poem and subdivide it into sections that correspond to stages of an argument. Now, there are two other things perhaps that we might have dealt with, but we made a decision not necessarily to deal with them. We'll deal with one, however, and that is the term mood. Now, mood is a term that has two different meanings depending on which scholars you interface with. For some scholars, it's a synonym for the word atmosphere, the feeling created in the world of the poem. For other scholars, it refers to the emotional state of the speaker or some character in the poem. I'd like you, one, to be aware of both meanings, and secondly, to apply the latter one, the emotional state of the speaker, to this poem. We've indicated in our discussion that the tone or the attitude is one that you can describe with a variety of words. Serious, confrontational, defiant, reproving or criticizing or castigating or reprimanding death. And now we want to share a few words, and you can think of others because there's lots of synonyms for the state of mind of the speaker. Clearly, the speaker in this poem is confident. That's not just a state of mind. Self-assured, assertive, determined, because we can see the inexorable, the unflagging progression of this argument from death has no real power, never mind some people think it's mighty and proud, to death itself will actually die, whereas human beings will live. So we can see that the state of mind of this person is confident and self-assured and so on and so forth. And in some cases, the same word that defines the tone or the attitude can define the mood, such as defiant. All right? Now, it would be an injustice to you students, teachers, and viewers if we moved on to the extra textual information and said nothing about the central idea, message if you like, of this poem. So the subject or topic is what the speaker is dealing with. That is death or death's arrogance or pride. But what is the main idea about this element of human existence communicated in this poem? Who would like to take that? What's the theme or the most important theme of this poem, Death Be Not Proud?
Yeah, I think I can just jump in here as well. As you mentioned before, yes, it's a poem about death, but if we look carefully throughout the text, it seems more to be an attack on the hubris of death itself, the pride that death seems to have, because as Adam mentioned before, we don't get a response from death. So we can see the attack on death's hubris, which is why he says later on, why swellest thou then? Why feel that sense of pride? Because you are essentially nothing. So if you really want to zero in on the theme, I think that's one that we can really take away. Not so much the fear of death itself, but that hubris, that sense of pride that death seems to have.
Okay, so Roderick, would you say then, would it be acceptable to say that from your perspective, one could argue that the theme or a major theme of this poem is that death's pride or arrogance is unjustified. Could we put it that way?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you, Roderick. Dawn Marie, Adam, would you want to word the theme differently or identify it differently?
All right, I wouldn't. I don't want to word it differently, but I want to extend a little bit on what Roderick just mentioned. And sorry, I'll give you just a bit of an imagination. So imagine you're a teacher. You're a substitute teacher, perhaps. You've gotten this dreadful, terrible remedial class, and they have no interest in learning. Some kids are standing on the desk, some are sleeping, some are on their cell phones, and you decide you need to get this class under control ASAP. What you do, because you're a wise teacher and you have some experience, you look for the strongest boy in that class, the big bad bully, the one who all of them respect. You take him and you embarrass him and flog him right in front of the blackboard. What happens next is all of the other kids automatically fall in line. What John Donne does here is he embarrasses and flogs death. But I think the main aim of this, the purpose, right, is that we will see and we will feel this sense of victory over death, because, well, if this man can talk to death as if he's just a little puppy, then why should I be afraid of death? I think that death is personified and anthropomorphized, and we have this apostrophe. I think the point is not necessarily just about embarrassing death or arguing with death or being argumentative with death. But the idea is we should take from this argumentativeness the fact that death is nothing to fear. And we should not consider it, as we look at 9.2, to be mighty and dreadful. Because death is just a delivery man that's going to take us to the afterlife. And so I think one of the themes that we can coin is a reconceptualization of death. So the disempowerment of death is one theme, but I think that is used to drive home what might be an even deeper theme, a more to the point theme, which is understanding that we have power over death, and understanding that death is not final, death is not great, death is not ultimate. Death, just like everybody else, will die. The only difference is death will not wake up to an eternal life. And so we have the embarrassment of death, the disempowerment of death as one theme, but I think coming from that, we have the idea of this reimagining of death, or refining or reconstituting our relationship to death, or our thoughts about death. So I think this speaker is trying to change what we think of death.
Thank you, Adam.
Empowerment.
Mm-hmm. So notice, viewers, students, and teachers, that we've got a consideration of the central idea of this poem from, I would say, two opposite perspectives. Roderick looks at it from this perspective of dealing with death. Death, you have no reason to be proud because you're ultimately powerless. On the other hand, Adam looks at it from the perspective of people. People, you need not fear death because death is not ultimately powerful. In fact, it will die itself, whereas you have eternal life to look forward to. So notice the way in which two informed readers can engage with the same literary work and come to two different conclusions, at least in terms of the wording, about what's the central idea, and you can see the reasoning behind both perspectives. Dawn Marie, anything that you want to say in agreement, or you want to offer an alternative perspective before I share mine?
It's in a way agreeing with what Adam has said. The poem offers us humans a sense of hope, whereas we may have looked at death with a sense of hopelessness, that we will inevitably die one day and we will fear that day. Donne here with his poem gives us a sense of hope because he has flipped the script on death, essentially, especially in that final couplet, that death shall be no more, death thou shalt die, but we shall wake eternally. It's giving the audience, the readers, a sense of hope. That's my take on it.
Thank you, Dawn Marie. And I'm glad you used that word hope, because my way of articulating the theme will tie in with what you said. Now, if one comes to this poem without a Christian background and knowledge of the Bible, clearly one will not recognize that the last line of the poem is an allusion or reference to Revelation 20, 14 that says that death and hell will be cast into the lake of fire. So one could agree with Dawn Marie, one could agree with Roderick, one could agree with Adam in terms of how they've identified or worded the theme of this poem. But because I know of Donne's circumstances, and I've had the upbringing in, Christianity and so on, for the reader who comes from that perspective, I think we might want to put the wording of the theme something like this. A Christian has no reason to be intimidated by death or to see it as mighty or powerful, because we have the hope, to use Dawn Marie's word, that if we continue to live a godly life up to our death, we will live forever, whereas death itself will be destroyed. So notice that you can use different wording, you can use different emphases depending on your perspective of the poem, but you must be able, as Adam said repeatedly, to support what you're saying from the text. You don't have to agree with another student, you don't have to agree with the teacher, you don't have to agree with the scholars, but for anybody to find what you're saying acceptable, you must be able to properly support it from the text. So now, let's come to some of those extra textual details that might help readers appreciate this poem. Feel free to go first.
Well, in some research, I noticed that it's considered the poem was written in 1609, where there were several outbreaks of the bubonic plague, and of course there would have been death all around. We know that plague is very serious, so maybe we can say that with that background, Donne wrote the poem again to give hope in this sense of hopelessness, this time of death all around. Everybody is just worried that, their family members are dying, their friends are dying. They need some anchor to hold on to. We can look at the poem as an anchor and a way of, again, flipping the script on death, giving yourself hope in this time of darkness.
Wonderful, Dawn Marie. And it's wonderful for two reasons. Notice Dawn Marie says, in the time when Donne is supposed to have written, because scholars don't know for sure when he did, there was this epidemic called the bubonic plague, or pandemic, because it was across a lot of Europe and so on, comparable to COVID-19. So that's a historical fact that says Donne might have been writing in a period when plague was pervasive. And no less importantly, notice that in making her point, Dawn Marie used the conditional word. She said maybe. She can't say for certain she's not John Donne. She can't travel through time just yet, so she can't have a conversation with him, but she's saying this is a reasonable way of thinking. It's a probability, it's a possibility. So you students will want to do the same thing if you use material from outside the poem and you don't know for sure that that influenced the poet. You use things like perhaps, maybe, possibly, it is conceivable that. That's a good way of putting in that information. Yes, please.
Yeah, if I can jump in as well. One of the things that we want to reinforce, especially to students also, some students would come to the classroom, they pick up the poem, they just read, and that's it. That can work at times. There's nothing essentially wrong with that. But if you do a bit of research, if you go into the history of the poet or the writer, and you get his background, get a sense of the times in which he lived, the times in which he wrote, that can also inform the poetry. And that's what really makes the poetry lift from the page now. You have a sense of time as well as a sense of the poet, the writer. In this case, when we look at Donne and his challenge or his confrontation with death, and we go back to his life, doing a bit of history, we can perhaps understand why he was so confrontational with death in his poetry. Because throughout his life, it seems as though Donne was fairly confrontational himself. We talk about the switch from Roman Catholicism to Anglicanism. We talk about the fact that he actually married his boss, who was his boss's daughter rather, who was his superior. And as a result, he suffered for that. In fact, for 10 years, he lived in some fairly difficult financial situations. So that confrontational aspect of Donne's life, the steps that he made in his life, can perhaps be reflected through his poetry as well. And death would naturally be a very, very significant topic for him, because the very woman that he married and loved, apparently, and had about 12 children with,
Yeah.
she died at 33. And he was so devastated that he never married again, which is why the church almost became his new love. So that sense of loss might also have been a reason why Donne was so very, very upset with death, why he challenged it to say, you know what, even though you might think you won, or you might think you took away something from me, you really haven't. And that kind of knowledge, like when you bring it to the page, now informs the poetry and it breathes a new life.
Very good, Dawn Marie and Roderick. And I will add that we are told in the Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, and we would go there because Donne is a British poet, so we would imagine that the English people would celebrate him and give us the facts as they understand them. When Donne was 4 years old, his father died. Roderick just told you about the death of his wife at a mere 33 years old. That Donne himself would have endured at least 2 significant illnesses, one of them what we would call typhoid fever, and then just a couple of years later stomach cancer, which actually took him out of the world. And in addition to this poem, which belongs to a collection called Holy Sonnets, and this is numbered as number 10, it hasn't actually got a title, which is why the first line is used as the title, that a number of these sonnets, I think there were 19 of them, half of the first 12 engaged with this topic of death. So as Roderick said, death was something that was very much a part of the experience and the consciousness of Donne, that he grappled with both as a human being and clearly as a writer. And he's written a number of other things in which he's engaged with this topic of death. In fact, there's a particular line from one of his writings that people all over the world knows, because in the old time days, people lived in closer physical communities. They traveled shorter distances because of agrarian society. So when somebody died, you didn't get WhatsApp or you didn't get, Instagram. The church bell would ring in a way that would say somebody has died. So
For whom the bell
Donne
tolls.
wrote this line, ask not for whom the bell tolls. In other words, who is dead based on the ringing of the bell, it tolls for thee, meaning, everybody is going to die. Death is inevitable and universal. Yes, Adam.
Yes, still looking at the time in which this poem was written. We're looking at perhaps 17th century. That is a generally accepted time frame. Donne mentioned the bubonic plague, a resurgence that was stated to have happened around that time. But there was also an uprising anti-Catholicism in which there was even death associated with that. So John Donne was grappling with and dealing with death from multiple angles and from multiple dimensions of his life. And then if you want to look at what would have been recent history in that time, now when you think of history in terms of a few centuries ago, the big thing that comes to mind might be slavery and the connected things. For them, it would have been what we now call the Dark Ages. That would have been their history lesson, learning about the Dark Ages 200 years before. So when persons would have thought about not just the current times, but even the past, the Dark Ages were a time when chaos, war, violence, and just all manner of evil was just the order of the day. So whether you looked into the recent past or you looked around you, death was what you were seeing. Death was the order of the day. And it would seem as if there is no hope, the future looks bleak, it looks grim. And of course, every generation might think this way of their own time. Now with COVID, we might have said, oh, this is it, the world is ending. Well, John Donne, in his own rights, would have thought the same in his time. And many centuries before him would have thought that as well. And the future might not be any different. And another thing, as you look at where this poem could be placed, Sam already mentioned that this would have been Holy Sonnet 10 in a set of other similar poems. But we also know that John Donne was a famous elegist. In fact, perhaps the most famous elegist. And what is an elegy? This primarily might be a song, a poem dedicated to someone who you love or someone who you miss. But it can also be a poem of grief, a somber poem where you grieve the loss of a loved one. So I think John Donne is perhaps being a little snarky here by writing these death poems, being this elegist. And so we have here John Donne kind of grieving death in a way. We know that he's not very sincere in grieving death, because the point is, death, you're nothing. You're going to die. We don't need to fear you. But the idea is, we're looking at this elegist who writes about grief, writing about death. So what should we imagine? We should imagine that death is something that should be pitied, something that we shouldn't be fearing, but something we should be holding a funeral for. We should be having a funeral for death. So looking at the context of John Donne's writings, we see that this poem fits in quite well, and it's not an isolated poem that he just wrote out of nowhere. It really fits into the context of his works, his literary works, and also the context of his life and his time. And so as the other panelists have mentioned, by looking at the overarching context of the poem and of the poet, you really get a lot more insight into what things could possibly mean, and you're able to do a much better job justifying things and just being more impressive, to be honest, in the exam. When you get an unseen poem, when you get an unseen piece of poetry, you do not have the ability to talk about context, because you wouldn't have known anything about that poem. But with these 20 poems, you have the ability to, before the exam, look at some of the contextual details. And so you're going armed not just with knowledge of the text, but of knowledge around the text. And that can really, if you even mention these things incidentally or parenthetically, you're really showing a sort of mastery of the text that perhaps most students might not be able to show.
Very good point, Adam. Mm-hmm. So, viewers, students, teachers, general audience, this brings us to the conclusion of our consideration of John Donne's sonnet, Death Be Not Proud. To recap, we've looked at the subject matter, we've looked at the structure as an argument, and the way this structure is complemented and reinforced by the pattern of a rhyme, showing the 4 stages of the argument. We've considered several devices that the poet uses and the effect of using these devices. And we've encouraged you not to substitute knowledge of the actual poem on the page, but to add to it, to complement it by doing, where possible, some research and seeing what aspects of the poet's life, his circumstances, what was going on in the country at the time, and so on, might have contributed to what you actually have on the page. So we would like to thank you for being with us and being viewers, and we encourage you, as we do, to love literature and continue to follow CSEC Circle.